Justice Committee on the good works. Good morning and welcome. Having sat with families at the hospital bed, seriously ill and dying, or listened while an older person worried about what will happen next, I can attest that there are conversations that should have happened prior that were avoided. These are some difficult conversations that we will at some point have to have with loved ones about illness and loss. It could be the talk of an adult child with an aging parent, or it could be the talk of a parent might have with a younger child about the illness or loss of a grandparent, a sick classmate, or the death of a parent or of a classmate. To the extent that these topics tend to be unnerving, both because of the sad subject for the one who is ailing and the speaker's own unresolved feelings of loss and grief, it may help to understand better one's own feelings and get some tools to help understand what the other side of the conversation is feeling. And that's why I'm so glad that the Brotherhood Chesed Committee is sponsoring this program with such distinguished keynote speakers and important follow-up workshops. May God bless us in all our conversations. I want to invite Brenda to introduce our speakers.
I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce our speakers, our guest this morning. Rabbi Mychal is the Helen Freed Kirschblum Goldstein Chair in Professional and Pastoral Skills and the Director of the Center for Pastoral Education at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Certified Supervisor of the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education and a Certified Jewish Chaplain, Rabbi Springer served as Associate Dean and Director of Field Education at the Rabbinical School of the Jewish Theological Seminary for 7 years. During that time, she transformed field education and pioneered strategies in integrating teaching and learning for rabbinical students through her work as a director of a grant from the Wabash Center. To her left, Dr. William Breitbart is chairman, the Jimmy C. Holland Chair in Psychiatric Oncology and the Chief of the Psychiatry Service, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, New York City. Dr. Breitbart is also attending psychiatrist, Palliative Medicine Service, Department of Medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Well Medical College of Cornell University. And it's my pleasure, having had the pleasure over quite a number of years hearing both of our guests speak and participating in some direct work with some of them, or not so direct work. It's my pleasure to have them here with us. And we thought the format was, in our discussions, that each would present about 10 minutes of their own comments, then have a dialogue together and invite conversation and dialogue with our community. And I'm going to turn this over to Rabbi Springer and then moderate their initial comments. Thank you. Is this working?
Is that one?
Yes.
Should I stand up?
Yes.
Okay. It's great to be here. Thank you, Rabbi Alder and Kazan Weiss and Brenda for putting this all together. Brenda and Bill and I had a great conversation prior to today, and I think we're just going to pick up where we were. What we got to in thinking about illness and loss and grief is wanting to explore vulnerability and the role that vulnerability plays in our lives in general and in our faith lives. So I've been thinking about a book by Catherine Henderson, who is the president of Auburn Theological Seminary. She wrote a study about women's religious leadership, and I was privileged to be included as one of the leaders that she interviewed for this project. It was for her thesis, and then she turned it into a book. And one of the images in her book that really spoke to me was from one of the leaders who talked about God getting low with people. In my growing up, we would often talk about the exalted God, and we would aspire to get high, legitimate, to rise to God. But this leader spoke about getting low, that God is God's greatness consists of being able to get lower than us, the humility, the vulnerability. Now, we're familiar, to the degree to which we're familiar with this, I think we're familiar with it as a Christian concept of God in the vulnerability, and not as much in Judaism. But I would say that the vulnerable God exists very much in Judaism. That's the God to which Abraham Joshua Heschel was very drawn. And so I want to explore a bit the vulnerable God. When I was a senior in rabbinical school, I was a year away from being ordained, and I had completely lost my way. I knew a lot. JTS was always a great place for learning a lot, but the more I encountered real life, and I was in my mid-20s, the less I could say that the world that I had thought I understood, and the way that God worked that I thought I understood, had stopped making sense to me. Being in close contact with lots of people who were suffering, I didn't really feel that I could go out into the world as a rabbi and proclaim that this is how God works, and if you put your faith in God, everything will be all right. It just didn't seem that way. For me personally, it was tied up in an experience of depression and the way that the world didn't make sense from a place of being depressed. And I went to one of my mentors, Dr. Sam Klagsburg, and I said, Sam, what do I do? I don't really think I can be a rabbi. I don't think I have anything to offer anyone. And I don't know how to help anyone. And I thought that as a rabbi, I would be helping people. And Sam said, you should go to Memorial Sloan Kettering and do their clinical pastoral education program. And I said, okay. I didn't really understand how going into a hospital with dying people was going to relieve me of my depression and give me a sense of where faith was. That was a little mysterious. But being here today with Bill, who's at Memorial, it's sort of nice to come around and be able to have this conversation many years later. That was back in 1991 when I did that. What I discovered at Memorial was that the things that I feared the most, the blows to my faith that had seemed so lethal, were actually given the space to be talked about. I had an amazing supervisor, Sister Teresa Brophy, Alea Shalom. She was loving and challenging, and she made the space for all the questions. And what I discovered is that the vulnerability that I had experienced as a person and as someone who cared for other people was not something that I needed to push away in order to come to faith. In fact, I needed to embrace it. And that the faith and the doubt needed to come together. There's a clinical pastoral education, CPE, saying that, and I know that it comes from some Christian community somewhere, that only faith that has doubt is actually strong faith. I had never been taught that. I had thought that my doubts were undermining of any faith that I could have. And so, being in a religious community where faith and doubt could be held up together, and where I could learn to pray in a whole new way, transformed me. So one of my teachers was a woman, let's call her Margot, who was 43 years old, and she was dying of ovarian cancer. A lot of the women, I worked on the ovarian cancer floor. It's kind of cruel to take a young woman in her 20s and put her on the ovarian cancer floor. Sort of stayed with me forever, the vulnerability of knowing that there could be something very deadly growing in your body, and ovarian cancer in particular, something that if you don't catch it before it's really happens, it's hard. So a lot of my patients died, and Margot was dying. And one of the ways in which she was my teacher is that she wanted to pray with me. And when I said that I was in crisis, part of why I was in crisis is that I didn't know what prayer was or could be. I knew the set prayers. I was really good at seeing that, I knew really well. But what would it mean to open up my heart and pray and believed that it mattered. Did God hear prayers? They seemed like really basic questions, things that I had thought I understood when I was younger and that had gotten opened up for me and were very confusing. And I didn't want to be inauthentic, and I didn't want to offer her hope for something that I myself couldn't believe in, because that seemed cruel in the face of her dying. And she was a person who really wanted to understand things, so she didn't want me to give her a false bomb. When she said she wanted to pray with me, she really wanted to know, what would an authentic prayer look like? What would we be doing? What could we say? It was probably the hardest moment of my emerging rabbinate when I said, well, I really don't know how to pray. And she kind of looked at me. I said, I don't, but you want to pray? I would love to be able to pray. I don't know how to do it. You don't know how to do it, so maybe we'll figure it out together. And she said, okay, so when I write in my diary, I write Dear Diary. So what if we say Dear God? I said, okay. Never prayed like that, but okay. I never prayed in English before. I had always thought prayers had to be in Hebrew. So we began to pray in English, Dear God, and there was something so humble and so simple and so low about that opening up of the heart. And there was room in that prayer for the doubt. There was room for the, I don't know if this is ridiculous. I don't know if you hear us. I don't know what this is. And the total transparency of that experience began to shift something for me. Precisely because as we prayed in this very unfluid way, we could feel something together. And in that feeling something and not needing to have authoritative understanding of what it was that we were feeling, both of us could open up a little spiritual pathway. And we began to pray together regularly, and when in fact she did die, she asked me if I would do her funeral, which I did. She had a son who had just turned bar mitzvah. And all of those questions about where God is in the life of a family where a child is 13 and his mother dies, those questions were allowed to live alongside that opening up of a pathway of prayer. And so the faith that I thought was intact, that had been shut down in the face of the great vulnerability of this world, was able to open up a little bit when my faith could include that doubt and that anger and that sense of things not making sense and the possibilities of coming together in new ways that the new kind of integrated faith allowed for. And I found that for me, being in a community where people were asking these questions together, people of faith, the nun who was my supervisor, my colleagues in my peer group, that I didn't feel inauthentic anymore. I didn't feel like I had to hide anything that I was or was not believing, the rage that I had, the vulnerability that I had. And my faith life opened up. And being with you today, I have a very robust sense of my faith, a faith that can absorb the blows, a faith that can be outrageously enraged when those moments come and doesn't have to push it away. Because what I've learned is that in that lowness, there's room for everything. And that allows the mystery and the comfort to be present too. Along the way, I discovered that our tradition teaches about God who is vulnerable, not just people who are vulnerable. And one of the prayers that does this really beautifully is during Sukkot. I know we're just finished with Pesach, so I'll just flip us ahead 6 months. And in Sukkot, when we circumambulate the synagogue with the Hoshanas, with the lulav and etrog in our hand, one of the prayers that we say is Ani v'hoi Hoshiana, God save us. And in that very ancient piyut, God is referred to as being in need of being saved. We don't usually pause and pay attention to it, but Abraham Joshua Heschel did. So I'm going to read you a couple of those lines. As you saved the chorus who sang out, God saved, and you who gave birth to them were saved with them, help us now. Right? So God was saved with us coming out of Egypt. That's fine. As you freed them, declaring, I will bring you out, which our sages interpreted, I went out with you. Hoshana, help us now. As you accompanied the people you sent into Babylon, journeying into exile with them, help us now. The God who goes into exile with us, the God who needs to be freed with us. Our experience and God's experience are intertwined. So when we're in these places of vulnerability and lowness, God is in those places too. Usually, the most spoken about aspect is the Shekhinah, God's indwelling presence, who roams the earth with those of us who are in exile and participates in that experience of vulnerability that is human existence. I think we need to speak more about the vulnerable God, the God who needs to be redeemed along with us. And we need to speak about the ways in which, when we act towards one another in ways that are redemptive, we participate in redeeming one another the way that God is redeemed with us. God is redeemed through those acts as well. And so it doesn't give us a God who's way up high and separate from everything that we go through. Not exclusively. Judaism always has the indwelling God and the more God of out there God. And there has to be some link between the two. I think that we've erred on the side of focusing on the God the mighty and not enough on the God the vulnerable, and the way that can contribute to the alienation that we feel in our lives. If we build that bridge between those different aspects of God and let God be mighty and vulnerable and recognize both the might that we have, the power, the incredible power that we have as individuals and communities, and the vulnerability that we have as human beings, I think we'll all be much more able to face the complexity of our lives and move towards the healing that is possible even when there's brokenness. Thank you.